Good afternoon, JC.
Good afternoon, Father Nick.
Welcome back to episode 5 of Discernment Straight Up.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah.
We've been having a few technological issues over the last few weeks, so we've decided to give up the live stream tonight and just go with a pure recorded podcast. So hopefully there's a little bit less for the evil one to try and sink his teeth into this week with taking out one less hurdle in the process of recording this, because we do think it's a really important conversation to have, this question about discernment, and in particular about discerning a vocation to the diocesan priesthood, which is often a challenging one for young men to get their head around, and one thing that we don't always talk about sort of straight up. So that's what the purpose of this podcast is, for us to have an open and frank conversation
about discernment. And it's so important enough that a whole book is written about it. So we've been going through To Save 1,000 Souls for the last 5 weeks now.
5 weeks. And we've been using the accompanying reading program, the Melchizedek Project, which was designed for college-age students or university-age students, really to address this thing that it shouldn't be something that we're afraid of, to have this conversation about discernment of a vocation. It should be something that we can discuss between men and priests. Yep. And that really, I suppose, brings us to tonight's topic, which is all around this idea of having a spiritual director and the importance of having a spiritual director, which is something that I know that some young guys here in Melbourne and Australia obviously struggle with, this idea of what is the role of a spiritual director. So what about you, JC? Can you remember the first priest you went to for spiritual direction?
All right. So a year prior to joining the seminary, I actually had no idea what a spiritual director was or what their role was in terms of the archdiocese. I didn't know that the archdiocese is a list of qualified spiritual directors, and that's the question: do you need to be qualified as a priest to do spiritual direction? You can answer that possibly later. But my experiences with spiritual direction came from meeting with my parish priest for the first time, and to actually speak to him outside the norm, which is confession, the sacraments, and just having small talk in the foyer. So we actually scheduled a meeting, and he said, "This is like spiritual direction," and I was like, what is spiritual direction? So that was my first encounter when it comes to spiritual direction. And
I think it is challenging because there is, I suppose, for want of a better term, a professional class. There's people who can go and study to be spiritual directors, and can take on this role in a more professional capacity. And that's a very important and valued part of the life of the church, people who have spent some time particularly looking at this. But I think when we're talking about spiritual direction in the terms of in the life of a young man, in particular in discernment, any priest who is a good priest, a priest in good standing, has the capacity, through the grace of his ordination, but also his lived experience of discerning himself and also his priestly life, to help a young man in the terms of spiritual direction. And Father Bannon points out in particular in this chapter 7, that one of the, I suppose, most important roles that a spiritual director has is helping a young man establish a plan of life. That the spiritual director's role is to help him sort of put in those composite elements in his day and in his week that are going to help him flourish in the spiritual life. And he speaks about the fact that at the end of the day, and he uses this quote from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux: a man who is his own master is the disciple of a fool. Which is a great. We're not always the best judge of our own character.
Yes.
And we're not always the best judge of how we're going or how we're tracking. And in particular, and I find this with young guys that I work with, we're not always the best judge of when we should be tougher on ourselves, or more particularly when we should be easier on ourselves. And sometimes our tendency, especially if we're struggling with particular sin or disappointments, or we're discouraged about certain things in the spiritual life, we think the first thing is to be harder on ourselves and to be tougher on ourselves. But often my role as a spiritual director in accompanying young men is to say, well, actually, go a bit easy on yourself, take it a bit easier. But sometimes we need to hear that from someone outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
So,
how open should you be to your spiritual director, Father Nicholas?
yeah, and that's a really good question. And Father Brandon speaks about this in To Save 1,000 Souls. And it's an important distinction when we start looking at guys who are discerning a vocation to the priesthood, and when they're also building a relationship with perhaps a vocations director or members of a vocations team or seminary staff, and that in the church there has always been this really clear line between the difference between what we call internal forum and external forum. And so our relationship with a spiritual director, once we've found a priest that we trust and who's agreed to enter into this relationship, is very clearly in the mind of the church a relationship of internal forum. And what we mean by that is it's not the same as the seal of the confessional, but it is the priest treats things that he hears in spiritual direction with the same gravity as things he hears in the seal of the confessional.
So it's extremely confidential.
Extremely confidential. There's no... it's not bound like by the seal, like confession is, but a priest treats the things he hears in the seal of confessional. And this comes to that very key point of what helps you find a good spiritual director is it has to be someone that you can be 100% honest with. If you're not willing to bare your soul and to speak completely honestly with your spiritual director as you would a priest in confession, then he's not the right spiritual director for you. So when I start spiritual direction with young men that I work with, and young women for that matter, I say to them at the very beginning, we need to spend a little bit of time working this out. Because at one point or another, you need to have the confidence that you can walk away from this relationship. Because if you're not feeling it, and we just generally know, and if you're not feeling it, if it's not going to work, then you're wasting my time and I'm wasting your time.
Father says in the book, think of the thing which you're afraid of revealing to your spiritual director and say that first. So to get all the things out of the way.
Get the hard stuff off. And I think one thing that, especially as young people, you need to remember is that, especially wise, older priests who have been doing this for a long time, they've heard almost everything before. It's very hard to shock a priest. We become very aware of human nature, and there's not particularly any new sins or new struggles. So it's very hard, and sometimes it's the hardest step is for us to get it out and put it on the table. And then we go from there. It's really important, though, that Father Brennan points out this distinction, though, between internal forum and external forum. Because he speaks about the fact that vocations directors and seminary staff work in what we call the external forum. And he makes a really clear point that if you're starting the process of discernment with a vocations director or a vocations team, that priest shouldn't be your spiritual director. That they're actually two quite distinct relationships. And for your good, and for the good of that priest, and for the good of the church, you need to be a little bit respectful of those boundaries. And that can often be hard because sometimes the relationship we start with that priest starts in the internal forum. It starts by going to confession at a retreat or a conference or a camp. And then we might then start moving into the process of discernment. We need to make a really clear choice then that we're not going to be seeing that priest for spiritual direction or for discernment.
It's a good point that you make. However, I only began to realize the differences between internal and external form. Even those terms were very new to me, and only in my first year of seminary I got to know them quite well. Is it the priest's duty then to say that this is an internal or external forum?
It's a challenging one because it's something that we don't want people to become neurotic over. I share certain things with certain people and certain things with others because especially guys who are preparing or thinking about a seminary formation program, it's actually about being open and being willing and able to share things and receive formation. So it can't be a matter of I'm speaking to my spiritual director and I'm hiding things from the vocations director. So Father Brennan speaks about this very, very specifically, but he makes the point in particular about confession, because the point about external forum is that it is actually the role of the vocations director to advise the bishop. And it's his role, after collating all of the various information from the process of discernment, to pass on and give advice to the bishop. And you make his role a little bit harder if he has to sort of discern himself if there's anything that he may have heard from the internal forum, as opposed to in the external forum. So in an act of charity, you're helping the priest out by not going to him for confession, because it makes it really clear with the vocations director that all your conversations with him are conversations that are in the external forum, and that he can then use with the wealth of all the information that he gathers when he makes his recommendation to the bishop.
Yeah, it's a very sophisticated and process, but it works.
It works, and it works to protect both the vocations director and also the young man. So those matters that you discuss with your spiritual director are matters of your conscience. And they're matters of what we call the internal forum. And your vocations director, your spiritual director shouldn't be reporting, and generally doesn't report to the vocations director of those conversations, unless you give him permission. Yep. And sometimes that might be the case, because in the process of applying for the seminary, you have to get recommendations from priests. And sometimes you may think that this relationship with your spiritual director makes him one of the best priests to give that application. So you can give him permission to report to the vocations director, but otherwise the vocations director should be on a regular basis asking whether you've been to spiritual direction. Yeah. And he can also be encouraging with you certain things to discuss in spiritual direction. Yep. But those things that you then discuss in spiritual direction are between you and your spiritual director. And this flows on, and this relationship continues to flow on with you through your seminary formation. Because again, the roles are quite clearly distinguished within the seminary between the role of the seminary spiritual director or your own personal spiritual director and the role of your formators. And that again is to protect them and to protect you. Because at the end of the day, your conscience has primacy, and you're not obliged in any part of the process to reveal that conscience to the vocations director, but you should never be concealing things from the vocations director. There needs to be, and this is an ultimate key to the entire process of formation, there needs to be a willingness and openness to be formed. Yes. And so if there is a particular matter of your conscience that you're struggling with, and you've brought it up with your spiritual director, more often than not, your spiritual director will say, I think you should discuss this with the vocations director. Or I think you should discuss this further down the track with your seminary formators. And then it can be the role of the vocations director or the bishop or the seminary staff to help you work through these problems.
So it's a network of support.
Yeah. And if we start off being fearful and being closed and concealing things, then we're never going to get anywhere.
Indeed. So finding a good spiritual director, one that is suited to you, is so important. Yeah,
and I think don't be afraid to test without sort of shopping too broadly. Yep. Don't be afraid to find somebody that fits. It needs to be a comfortable fit, and you'll know it when it happens. Yeah. But also, I've seen this a number of times with young men that I've worked with, but also with young men through the vocations office. Your spiritual director's job is to push you sometimes.
Oh, yes.
I
can agree.
As soon as it gets tough, don't cut and run, because you want a spiritual director who's going to challenge you. And sometimes, as I said before, that challenge is going to be to tell you to calm down or to go a bit slower or to be a bit kinder on yourself. And sometimes that can be more challenging than anything else. Yeah, I can imagine, JC, that you've been told to work a little bit harder, be a little bit more attentive. But it is someone that you should be able to build a really close and trusting relationship. Yeah. And you should go, and Father Branham speaks about this in chapter 7, you should be going to confession to your spiritual director. He said one of the tendencies with young men in particular, especially if they're struggling in the areas of purity, is to go shopping for confessors. Yeah. And this week go to this priest, and that week go to another priest, and make your way around and around, so as no one really knows the full story. And he says one of the things, especially if you're discerning a vocation, is to pick one confessor, a regular confessor, so that he knows the whole story. And then from confession, spiritual direction flows. Yeah. Or spiritual direction happens and it finishes with a good confession. So it should be an extension of what's happening in the confessional. And again, we do this all the time as priests, but quite regularly we'll say to young people, okay, this is great, but there's 15 people in the line. If you actually really want to grow in this area, then come and have a chat with me afterwards. Now, we, of course, can't follow people up afterwards, but it's your responsibility, because there's only so much advice, encouragement, support that the priest is ever going to be able to give you in the confessional itself.
And it makes sense. You see someone professionally, if you have difficulties with your mental health, and you go through that journey and that process, and it's very transparent, and they look at your life, and they see the aspects in which you need to grow. And I suppose this the spiritual director, and if you do go to the sacrament of confession to him, will give you the right advice, because you've actually journeyed on, and you've been transparent. You did the hard work in getting to know and building a relationship with that person.
I think one of the other things about spiritual direction, and we learn this from the Desert Fathers in particular, is that once you've picked a spiritual director, there should be some primacy given to that priest's advice. We pick a spiritual father. Yep. And again, I think one of the tendencies for young men in discernment is to talk to lots of people. And take lots of advice. And we really encourage that as part of the discernment process, is cast the net wide, get lots of opinions. But at one point or another, there should be a certain amount of primacy given to your spiritual director, who knows you deeper over time than other priests. Yep. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be discussing or talking about your vocation or about the idea of vocation with lots of priests and lay people and religious. But at the end of the day, your spiritual director's voice should ring a little clearer and a little louder through everything. And at one point or another, you should be able to trust your spiritual director to guide you. And again, Father Brennan points out that it's not his role to make decisions for you, but it is his role to guide you. And sometimes that might mean a little bit of a push. Yep. And I still remember in my own discernment process, my spiritual director said to me, "I think it's time for you to call the vocations office." And it was like a punch in the chest.
Right.
And I was then particularly angry at him because he never gave me a phone number or an email address or anything. So I then had to go away and sort of discover that all for myself. So he didn't call the vocations director for me and make the appointment, but I needed him at this point to actually cut through and say, it's time. And I really very much appreciate to this day the fact that he was willing enough to actually put his finger on it and say, okay, you've done this long enough. And I trusted him, and I trusted that he knew me well enough to be able to help me discern that in a more sort of definitive way. And I suppose that brings us to the next part, which is chapter 14 of To Save 1,000 Souls, where Father Brennan really addresses this really sort of pivotal question of when. When do I go? What is the right time for a young man to enter the seminary? And he uses the analogy of fruit on a tree. And he says, if you pick it too early, it's not ready.
It's not ready, yep. And if you pick
it's a bit hard and you end up throwing it away. But if you leave it too long on the tree, it's then going to rot. And you can't eat it either.
Yes, that's a very interesting, because he actually leans more onto the earlier side. If do you agree? Like he calls them lifers, and I have no idea what that means, but maybe it's an American thing. And he calls them lifers because these men, from a very early age of their adulthood, say late teens, early 20s, have decided to follow the Lord, and basically their youth is for Jesus. So I think he leans more on the
I think he does in terms of, if you know, go. And I think this is the point that he makes, is that sometimes the tendency is for people to think, I'm too young, or I don't have enough experience. And there was a period of time in the church where guys were probably encouraged to wait a lot longer before they gave it a go.
So it's not particularly from the men. It's the people around him who say, experience life.
Yeah, and I had a number of people who said that to me, sort of go out and see the world first and then come back. But I was lucky enough that I'd felt the call quite young.
Could I ask you, how old were you?
I was 16, and it rocked my socks. And it took me then 4 or 5 years. And this, I think, is the point that he makes. The first question is, how long have you been discerning? So if you're 18 years old or 19 years old and you've only been discerning for 3 or 4 months because you've just got back from a youth festival or a World Youth Day, then the answer is going to be one thing. But I suppose if you're lucky enough like me and you felt the call at a World Youth Day when you were quite young, but then I spent 4 or 5 years, including a couple of years after school, university and working, and I was ready to go when I was 20 because I was lucky enough. But I had been discerning for a period of time. So I think that's one of the things he points out is that if you're going young, okay, it's not necessarily a problem that you're young, but have you done enough discernment before making that next step? And I think the other point he points out is then about education. Like there's a serious amount of study and a serious amount of life skills and maturity that's needed. And some guys, when they're 19, are ready. Some guys, when they're 19, aren't ready. So it's for some guys, it might be more appropriate that they do 1 or 2 years at university. And for other guys, they might be ready to go straight after school. So again, he points out how long has this been happening for? And the other area that he points out for is those guys who are converts or particular reverts to the faith. People who have become Catholics by their own choice as adults, that the church generally requires at least 2 years after they've been received into the church before entry into seminary. But that's similar to a certain degree to young guys who may have been away from the practice of their faith for a long time. And I was sort of in that court. But we have this experience more and more now where young guys who didn't grow up practicing in their faith or haven't practiced for many years then have a powerful experience of the Spirit at a particular event or through some type of prayer experience. And then the church says, okay, let's let this settle and see whether it remains over a period of time.
Yeah.
The other point he makes, though, is also, and this comes back to that question about that conversation between you and your spiritual director, and then any of those conversations that need to go into the forum with your vocations director, is the question, is there any particular issues? And we have to be realistic about this. We live in sort of a very different world to any other generation, and there's not many guys who come to the thought of a vocation, in particular a vocation of the priesthood, without some kind of wound or brokenness, with something in their background that needs to be mended. And that the seminary helps in that process, but sometimes there's things that we are best mended before we start the process. So being able to identify any of those things before a guy enters into the seminary process, and being able to work through some of those areas with the help of spiritual direction or with a vocations director or with some wise other people. It's quite often now the use of some kind of psychology or counselling to help deal with some issues from the past is not uncommon for guys because, again, we want people to be well-rounded and ready to start formation so that they can receive everything that is offered.
Yeah, thinking back to my discernment earlier on, I actually thought about, like, I'm going to go and I feel called to the seminary, but I have these things that I need to talk about. And it was always on the forefront of my thoughts. And having a spiritual director and actually seeing, good people who are actually very supportive allowed me to open up. And it was the first thing I talked about. It wasn't about what's it like being a priest. It's like, I have this issue, I have this problem. And just to let it go and give it to someone to discern about with me and to support me in that journey really helped. It's like a load that's off, and the discernment process became much easier.
And I think we have to remember that God doesn't call us in spite of our sins and our brokenness. He calls us with them. And if the sense of a vocation is there and it's growing, that young men shouldn't be afraid of their brokenness or of any challenges that they might be facing now. if they're actively discerning and there is this sense of a vocation growing in their heart, then place these things before a wise priest or a spiritual director, bring them up with the vocations director, and use the resources of the church and the history of the spirituality of the church and of good psychological assistance and other tools and aids that the church has at our disposal to help you to grow in these areas. And I think this is one of those big points as well. And Father Branham points this out. No guy who's gone early has ever regretted it. Very few, if any, and I don't know personally of any. I don't want to say that there's never been a guy who's walked out of the seminary and said that was a terrible experience. There might have been, but at least from the time of my time going through the seminary here in Melbourne, and of the guys I know in other parts of Australia who have gone into the seminary and then left, they've discerned out, is I suppose the terminology that we've used. They've all appreciated the experience that they've had, the friendships that they've formed. Some of my very good friends who are now married with children and families are people I met because they spent 1, 2, 3 years in the seminary and then discerned out.
Yeah, because they're better equipped in facing the world.
It's just really great because I thought if you're listening to the podcast live, we thought we'd had all the technology sorted out here, but we obviously haven't because the phone has we were getting so close to the end of our technology, but I thought I put the phone on airplane mode, but I hadn't.
Our bases covered.
We were getting so close. Where were we?
He mentioned something very profound, which I would like to take up with you, is that when you answer your vocation quite earlier on, when you get that call and you're quite young still, and you've got your young adulthood just ahead of you, he says that if a man who answers his calling quite early, and then possibly even discerns out of the priesthood, his time in the seminary allows him to be prepared for what's to come in his adult life, and in the same way it preserves him from like the greater dangers out there in the world.
Yeah, and I think at a really fundamental level, what is a seminary? It's a residential community of Catholic men who are studying the history of the church and studying philosophy, and especially in those first couple of years, studying scripture and the history of thought and how we see the world, and they're praying each day and they're growing in virtue. These things are good things for men, whether they go on to the priesthood or not.
It brings me to the point of those who discern quite long and who are sort of stuck in at a discernment stage. It's like they're choosing to be exposed to elements, to be tempted, to be pushed around by Satan himself, then rather, let's choose Jesus first. Let's go to the seminary. Let's discern in there, and be formed. And that's a painful reality I think many young men can relate to.
Yeah, and again, this is where I was very appreciative that my spiritual director was able to say to me, "It's time. You've done as much as you can do outside the seminary, and there is a danger." And he said this to me because I said, "I want to be 100% certain. I need that lightning bolt." And he said, "Well, there's only been very few saints in the history of the church who have been 100% certain." And he said, "I know you. You're not a saint. Not much has changed." But he said, "So just be careful." He said, because if you're waiting for that certainty, if you're waiting that 100% surety, then you may never go.
Yes.
And I think Father Branham points this out. No one expects you to be 100% certain. He said, don't jump too early and don't allow yourself to be pushed or jump in too soon. He said, but don't be a fence sitter. Don't wait too long, because if you do wait too long, whether it's the dangers of the world or the temptation of the evil spirit, or whether it's just the coldness of your own sort of heart and approach to your faith, vocations can be lost. And we spoke about this a few episodes ago. Does it mean you will never be happy with the rest of your life? No, but does it mean that in one way you have not fully cooperated with God, what God wanted to do with you, and remembering that the discernment of your vocation is not just for you, but it's for the church.
Yes.
And that the Lord wants to do something remarkable with you and with your life.
That's very interesting, because I've met a few guys who feel that going to the seminary is a definitive choice. Well, it's not definitive, because you either become a priest or you discern out.
And the seminary staff will tell you that.
Yeah.
And I think we've spoken about this before. If you turn up to your meeting with the rector and say, I'm 100% certain that I'm going to be called to be a priest, he's going to very quickly put a big cross next to your name. If you know what I mean. Nobody expects you to be 100% certain on the day that you start the seminary. There is an element of courage. There is an ability to jump out of the boat and to trust in the Lord. That is part of the discernment process. And again, as we started this episode with having the advice and trusting the advice, and trust in the church and trust in priests is not always an easy path to follow. But in order to follow our vocation, we're going to have to start trusting, because being able to trust your spiritual director is only the first step. Because then you're going to have to trust your seminary staff and the seminary spiritual director and the people whose parishes and communities you're sent to be formed under. And your entire life of service within the church is going to be about trusting in the bishop and trusting in his discernment of things. So that first ability to trust in your spiritual director and to trust in his advice and to follow his guidance is a really good part. We're done for tonight. We almost got through completely tech free, apart from the phone ringing halfway through.
You're a popular man.
I'm very popular. But next week we're going to be looking at that important question of the Eucharist and the centrality of the Eucharist, not only to the life of the priest, but to the life of the young man who's discerning it.
Yeah,
so,
beautiful.
Thanks, Jaycee. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Father Nicholas.
God bless.